The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
A leaked draft of the Supreme Court ruling that appears ready to do away entirely with Roe v. Wade and by extension Planned Parenthood v. Casey has set the cat among the pigeons. We have Democrats clamoring to make political hay out of it in hopes of staving off almost certain midterm defeat. Talking heads telling us that this is the death knell for freedom in America. And yet above all the noise and sound and fury, it seems that few people have actually stopped to examine precisely what this ruling means. Here's a clue. It's not what the legacy media pundits are telling us it is. It's time to pull back the curtain and see past the spin machine. Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. We have a special edition Roe v. Wade show for you today, where we discuss the political, constitutional, and legal fallout of the Supreme Court leak and what that means for America. If you want facts, analysis, and clear thinking on the topic that is significant in its ability to bring on paroxysms of hysteria, you've definitely come to the right place. This is going to be a huge show, so buckle up. I want to take a moment to say a special thank you to our listeners out in Dalton, Georgia on WBAC 1340 AM. Thank you for being here. And remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. With the leak of the Roe v. Wade opinion, naturally, politicians have come out of the woodwork seeking to raise funds and bolster their 2022 chances. As one of the most politically divisive issues in the nation, just how much impact will this have? Well, we're fortunate enough to be joined by Liberty Nation's Editor-in-Chief, Leesa K. Donner, to dig into the immediate political happenings. Welcome back and thanks for being here, Leesa.
Happy to do it. Mark, how are you today?
Not too bad. It's all excitement in the news business, which is both a good and a bad thing. So tell me, is this a Willy Wonka golden ticket for Democrats?
Well, they want it to be. They came right out of the gate, bursting. I mean, the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, within moments of the Politico release of the draft opinion of Alito's overturning Roe versus Wade, they were like, give to the Democrats. Save abortion, safe legal abortion everywhere. I mean, they see it as, their ticket in November to the midterms. I fear they may be overstating the case.
It's funny that you say safe legal abortion is on all the flyers, and I've noticed that on a lot of the begging letters and emails that come through. What they don't have on there, though, is safe, legal, and rare.
That's interesting that you picked that up. I was just going to say that was their talking point years ago.
It was, yeah. That appears to be out the window now. So that's one down and two to go, according to this one. So let's talk about the actual leak, Leesa. You wrote an article on LibertyNation.com where you discussed the motivation of the person committing the leak. Care to expand a little on that?
Well, there's theories and speculation for both sides, but I think we can safely put this to rest. Mark, it's not that big a universe. The Supreme Court is a small, insular place. I can't imagine that somebody didn't leave even the slightest digital trail. Apparently, if they actually did spirit out a real paper draft, that would be odd. Apparently, all the drafts get put through a shredder vertically, then they get put through the shredder horizontally, then they get made into some kind of a slurry. I mean, it's really hard to, I think, walk with a draft opinion. I think they're going to catch this person relatively soon, if not before when this airs.
Well, I mean, if this does come to the FBI investigation that Chief Justice John Roberts has requested, it really...
No. Just to be clear, he requested the court-martial investigate. I do not believe he requested the FBI.
Sorry, you're absolutely right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. But really, it would just be a case of checking or asking Politico, did somebody engage in sending you this? If so, was it somebody you know?
Well, but then you get into, reporters and sources and going to jail. And, I don't think they want to go that way when it's so much easier to get the real person. And let's face it, we're talking about 9 staffs, very small. I just don't see this.
Yeah, and apparently Adam Schiff wasn't anywhere near the building that day.
Well, let me just pivot a little bit towards the politics of this, because I really think that's what this entire story is all about. I think that's what the leak was about, and I think, it's very politically motivated. So let's take, for instance, the new Fox News poll that came out this week. They're predicting not a red wave, but a red tsunami. And so is everyone else. The Democrats know that. They're aware of that. So the models show, Fox's models show that the Republicans are going to pick up 44 seats in the House and 11 in the Senate. That is a tsunami,
Well, especially the Senate. That's crazy, 11 seats.
Yeah, well, and so that sets up the House and the Senate for, the presidential race. And then, they might be facing Trump, which really scares the bejesus out of them. But the most interesting thing about that Fox poll was the top concerns of Americans: future of the U.S., inflation, future democracy, political divisions. Abortion was not one of the top concerns.
So you don't think it will be the igniting force that the Democrats hope it will be?
Well, they want it to be. They're desperate to be, but I don't think so, because I heard Kellyanne Conway talking about it. She has a long history. She's a pollster. That was her business. That's how she met Trump. She's a very savvy pollster. And she said, this is not a binary issue. It's complicated. It involves law, morality, religion, politics, and the Democrats love one-step thinking. They hate absolutes. They don't, people in Americans in general don't like absolutes. They don't respond well to always, never, abolish, overturn, So if abortion was such a hot issue, why weren't the Dems talking about it before yesterday, Mark?
Well, that's a good point. Actually, in 2019, Joe Biden tweeted out that if he were president, he would codify Roe v. Wade into law, or make it codified into law. And obviously he hasn't done a single thing with that during his honeymoon period. And now it seems with Congress, both houses in the balance, that he's not going to be able to do it at all anyway. And yet they're hoping that this will be the impetus that will give them an increase in seats, which is practically unheard of.
I think the Dems run a risk making abortion a very high profile issue, because, it may galvanize the left, but it's certainly going to galvanize the right.
Yeah. So do you think this decision, if it turns out to be the actual decision from Justice Alito, do you see it as almost a sea change in how people will view abortion in America?
No. And, Mark, I think the Democrats think Americans are stupid, but I don't think they are. They understand that this is federalism. I mean, one thing that we should point out every time we discuss this issue is overturning Roe versus Wade does not end abortion in America. The left wants you to believe that it will, but that's not the truth. It throws it to the individual states to decide. It's classic federalism. Now, if people can cross state lines to buy booze, if they can cross state lines to take a vacation, if they can cross state lines to pick up Aunt Helen who's got gallstones, then they can.
It always comes back to Aunt Helen.
Yeah, then they can cross state lines for an abortion. I think Americans understand that.
Yeah, and obviously you've got states that are very keen to put out their abortion-friendly bona fides, with California, for example, saying that it's putting together a fund so it can pay for people to travel to California to receive abortions. So it's not as though that there's not going to be any abortion.
That's better than the American taxpayer paying, look,
that's the Californian taxpayer paying, certainly.
Yeah, and the argument that it doesn't benefit, that it's particularly difficult for poor people overturning Roe versus Wade just doesn't hold up to water, because the states, with the biggest urban populations are going to agree to provide abortions. And like you said, they'll even, some of them, find ways to pay for it.
Absolutely. Leesa K. Donna, thank you ever so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mark.
Later in the show, we have a special extended Talking Liberty segment where we dig deep into the legal aspects of Roe v. Wade being overturned. But up next, we're joined by James Fite to discuss the constitutional ramifications. Don't go anywhere.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
Immediately upon the news of this opinion coming out, we saw Joe Biden and other notable figures saying it's time to codify Roe v. Wade into law. But as well, we also witnessed an incredible amount of purposeful misinterpretations of what Roe v. Wade actually is. Well, to help us sift fact from fiction, we have with us author and editor James Fite. Welcome back to the show, Jim.
Hey, thanks, Mark.
So first question, Jim. What can President Biden and the Democrat-led Congress do to enshrine a right to abortion into law?
Are you asking that, constitutionally now that SCOTUS has ruled, or are you asking like practically as in their votes? Because it's kind of two different answers.
Well, let's start with the constitutional one. How would they go about doing this?
All right. So assuming that they want to just pass a law, what they'll need is what they need for any law, right? They're going to need just a simple majority in the House, and they're going to need 60 votes in the Senate, or they're going to have to nuke the filibuster and get 50 votes in the Senate or more. And, if they only have 50, then of course the vice president to break the tie. And they can do that.
Now, let's dive into that quickly a second, Jim.
Sure.
Bernie Sanders came out almost immediately saying that if needed, we should nuke the filibuster. Now, doesn't that set a dangerous precedent?
Oh, absolutely. That means whoever happens to have just a simple majority trifecta gets to dictate all the law in the nation for however long that lasts. I mean, and you see it, especially here lately. There's been a lot of tit for tat politics, right? You've seen it in Senate confirmations. You see it everywhere. And so get rid of the filibuster, and that's precisely what you'll see in federal legislation changing every 2 to 6 years.
So continue. How would the process go then? Let's say that they aim for 60 votes. Is that possible to get?
Yeah, at this point, I don't think they can get the 60 votes, Mark, which is the same problem they had the last time. They were trying to pass, and I guess this time they'll be trying to pass as well, what was called the Women's Health Protection Act. It was sort of an attempt to codify Roe, but it goes a little farther than what the practical reality of what Roe has actually done.
And what are the differences there?
Right. So Susan Collins of Maine and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, both self-declared pro-choice Republicans, actually opposed this bill and then introduced their own that didn't go anywhere. And what they wanted to do was basically what Roe does. No state can restrict abortion before the point of viability for any reason at all. And then abortions would still be allowed after viability for medical exceptions. And I think they would also have the rape and incest exception as well. So what the Women's Health Protection Act actually does is all of that, plus they want to do away with all of the restrictions before viability.
Okay, and which the Supreme Court now says is unconstitutional.
Right. Because what the Supreme Court now says is this is the sort of thing that the people should vote on when they vote for their local, their state representatives and governors and such. This is a state issue. The power resides in the people, not, 9 judges on the court.
So that's the thing. Before Roe v. Wade 50 years ago, the power to legislate over abortions rested with the individual states. And what we're seeing now is, I believe there's a majority of states, not necessarily a majority of people, just a majority of states
right.
that have some form of abortion restriction beyond that which we're used to talking about, I guess, with the coastal superstates.
Right. Yeah, there are 26 states that either have an abortion law already on the books or are working on a trigger law. Like, okay, if Roe v. Wade is overturned, this is what it's going to be. And some of these laws, by the way, aren't new. They're simply the law that was in effect when Roe v. Wade occurred and then became unenforceable. In fact, some of this is actually codified in some state constitutions.
Okay, so now, Jim, what happens if Congress does pass a law and the president signs it into law? What happens next?
All right, so they could, assuming that we overcome the practical hurdles of there just not being enough votes. Let's pretend like either A, there's no filibuster and there's enough people to support it, or there is a filibuster and there's even more people to support it. In this draft, which isn't official opinion yet, but very well could be, the conclusion begins with, and I quote, "We end this opinion where we began. Abortion presents a profound moral question. The Constitution does not prohibit the citizens of each state from regulating or prohibiting abortion. Roe and Casey arrogated that authority. We now overrule those decisions and return that authority to the people and their elected representatives." And then there's the final closing. But what that says is the federal government has no say in this. This is a state issue. So Congress could pass and Biden could sign a nationwide abortion protection, anywhere from simply codifying Roe to saying, hey, it's just a free for all. And let's say they nuke the filibuster to do this. And in 4 to 6 years, we have a Republican trifecta. They could pass a law that says abortion is banned 100% across the nation, but neither of those laws would square with how the Supreme Court ruled on this issue. So, I mean, they could still be passed, but when they're challenged, not if, because let's face it, both laws would immediately be challenged, the Supreme Court is almost certain to rule, hey, that's unconstitutional. Remember, we said that isn't the federal government's job.
So is there really any way for Joe Biden and his fellow Democrats to get what they want as things stand at the moment?
It depends on what they want. If they want plenty of attention, some fundraising, and maybe to kind of help mitigate the disaster that is sure to be the midterm elections for them, yeah, absolutely, they're on path. If they actually want codified Roe or for Roe to not be overturned, then court packing is certainly looking like it's on the table again.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of people talking about court packing until they get a favorable majority, I guess is the point. Right. But the problem with that is it's a never-ending train, isn't it?
Yeah, it's that same tit-for-tat politics. I mean,
Yeah, eventually you'll be on the Supreme Court as well, Jim.
That's it. And you know where I'm going to rule on the issue.
I think we can guess, Jim. Now, How do you see people in states reacting to this should, on the day that supposedly Roe v. Wade disappears, what's going to happen in those state legislatures?
Right. So what we're seeing now, and we've seen for a while, and what I'm pretty sure we're going to see if this does become official opinion, is really democracy at work. I wrote in a piece for LibertyNation.com that it's kind of ironic that the Democratic Party is the one that opposes this. What could possibly be more democratic? But so the states in which the majority of the voters don't want abortion, they're going to continue to elect representatives, senators, and governors who don't want abortion. And you will see abortion restricted in those states, whereas in other states, it will be either remain to be allowed or it will be specifically protected.
The equalization of America, just not in the way they wanted it. James Fite, thank you ever so much.
I appreciate it, man.
You're listening to Liberty Nation Radio, heard across the Radio America network from our flagship station in the nation's capital, WWRC in Washington, D.C. Remember, you can tune in for Liberty Nation on WBAC on 1340 AM out of Dalton, Georgia. Coming up next, we have an extended special Talking Liberty segment with constitutional attorney Scott D. Cosenza on the legal position of abortion in America and what it really means.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear for your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
And welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio. And ahead of us, we have a special two-part Talking Liberty segment for you, discussing the legal and constitutional aspect of the leaked opinion that looks to overturn Roe v. Wade. Now, what does it mean? What's the spin? And what's the reality? As ever, we have with us Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, constitutional attorney, and host of the always inspiring Uprising podcast, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza, Esquire. Thanks for being here, Scott.
My pleasure, Mark.
So, Scott, with the leaking of this opinion by somebody at the Supreme Court from Justice Alito,
maybe right?
Perhaps,
we presume.
This has really upset the entire apple cart. Now, obviously, there's the political aspects, there's the constitutional aspects, but really I want to dive first into the legal aspects of this. So this leak said that the abortion decisions will now go to the states and allow them to make their own laws. How does this impact the current law, the current standing of Roe v. Wade, and presumed by extension Casey versus Planned Parenthood?
So if this draft opinion, which is a draft opinion by those in the majority, so it's would be the controlling law if it was enacted fundamentally unaltered, which I expect it will be, by the way, then Roe v. Wade is completely and totally overturned, as is its legacy, namely the Planned Parenthood v. Casey case. And so it would be like Roe never existed. And so therefore we would revert back to what the law it was, or the situation regarding abortion law prior to 1973's Roe, which is that states may enact criminal penalties on abortion and abortionists. And that would be the state of the law. So there may be states like Massachusetts or New Jersey or California that allow nearly unfettered access to abortion, and states like Oklahoma or Texas that might crack down on it and make it criminally prohibited to perform or seek an abortion.
Okay, so what are the states doing right now to prepare for this? Presumably they are doing something.
Well, there are 13 states that have trigger laws in place that already criminalize abortion if it's allowed to be criminalized, right? So they kind of say, if this is constitutional, then it's illegal. And so the very second that opinion would be published, meaning if the Supreme Court publishes the leaked opinion or a variant of it that's substantially similar as their opinion in Dobbs, the case, then those prohibitions go into effect immediately, and full stop for any abortions in that state, for instance, if that's what the law had read. Apparently there are another 13 states that are basically fixing to enact these sort of trigger laws, and so that would be 26 obviously, where abortion would be prohibited in short order after the opinion came down. Again, this is all presuming that opinion stays substantially unaltered when it's issued.
Okay, now let's talk briefly about Roe v. Wade itself. So I've read a lot of criticism of the original Roe v. Wade decision, and this is even from people who are on the pro-choice side, saying that Roe was bad law. Can you explain that a little bit?
Well, it's a garbage decision, I would say. And I think that there's a lot of misreporting out there, or I don't know what the exact word would be for it, but there is a wide and
disinformation. It'll be passed on to the Disinformation Governance Board soon enough, I'm sure.
The thing is, there is a huge backlash against what I think is the result from this case. If it actually issues forward
as
unaltered, not Roe itself being overturned, and so much of the reporting on the case focuses on people being upset that Roe is overturned, but I don't think they are upset that Roe is overturned. And maybe this is an inside baseball kind of lawyer answer, but they're upset that the result of Roe being overturned means that there's a decrease in access to abortion services, or putting it mildly, of course, obviously in certain states where it's criminally prohibited. But they don't care that Roe was overturned. So if the Supreme Court said we're overturning Roe, but there is a right to an abortion found in some other place in the Constitution, presumably these folks would be just as happy to keep their abortion access rights. And Justice Alito spends a great deal of time in his, I believe it's like a 67-ish, 60-some page opinion that he wrote, laying out the reasons why Roe is a garbage opinion. It relies on false statistics, for instance, about abortions and abortion law, that basically there was a fraud committed upon the court in 73 when some of the briefing papers were submitted. And also just to kind of in Planned Parenthood v. Casey, for instance, just an absolute sop to stare decisis and public perception. And Alito goes into both of those in his analysis and discusses why that deference to Roe was too great, and also why the court needs to not worry about public opinion and instead worry about the Constitution more so.
That's something we'll get back to, is the public opinion side of this. But another criticism I've heard of the apparent decision by the Supreme Court in this particular case is that they're being accused of legislating from the bench. Now, my understanding of this obviously is from a fairly layman's terms, but it was my understanding that Roe v. Wade was technically legislating from the bench anyway, because there's not been anything codified into law.
Yeah, legislating from the bench is a charge that people on the left and people on the right make when they get a case that they don't agree with the result in chiefly, and that is not particularly narrow. So the broader in scope that an opinion is, the more likely they're going to get a charge of legislating from the bench. I don't see it in this case. I'm one of those people who is pro-choice and also thinks that Roe is a garbage opinion. So there's sadly less and less room for nuance in our politics with every passing year, it seems like. But that's an opinion that sort of doesn't make anybody happy, but it's true for me, which is that I think that Roe v. Wade should have been overturned. I think it was bad law when it was issued for, all the reasons that Justice Alito says. I think his opinion is great. And also, I think that there can be found a legal right to abortion within the Constitution without the manipulations of the law that I saw in the Roe v. Wade opinion.
Okay, let's get back to the justices in the leak, and we talk about pressure on judges. Now, there's a lot of speculation, and I think it's quite warranted in this particular case that the document was leaked in order to create a certain amount of pressure on the justices before a final opinion is released. Does that proposition hold any water, do you think?
Well, it may have been leaked for that purpose, and it's fun to speculate. I'm happy to do so. But let's be clear that this is speculation. We don't know. There's a case to think that this was done by a liberal justice for various reasons. Could be to encourage the passage of this federal legislation regarding Roe before the midterms, to help Democrats in the midterms by taking the focus off the devastation of our economy, take
the focus off literally every single other thing that's happening in the country today.
Right. There's all kinds. So there's several reasons why that may be the case, but there's also a case for a justice in the conservative camp to have leaked it in order to, the sort of hypothesis there is that one of the five in the majority is getting cold feet about overturning Roe. This was a February, a draft that was written in February. And so we don't know where things have gone since then in terms of, the strength of the sort of coalition, for lack of a better term, to vote this way. And the supposition would be like, oh, somebody's getting cold feet. If we leak this, then they'll sort of be locked in because they won't want to be seen as reacting to public opinion rather than their own independent judgment. So
just to reiterate, this is all speculative here that we're talking about. And
well,
I
absolutely,
think
I think it's not speculative that these may be the reasons why. There are only so many motivations that make sense for the leaking, and those are, I think, two of the best cases.
Okay, and there's a thing about the confidentiality of the court. Now, this is not just true of the Supreme Court, but true of every court and every legal chamber across the land. There's the need for confidentiality.
The court cannot function without confidentiality because, of course, one of the things that the court does is deliberate the fate of these cases, and those deliberations cannot exist without the confidentiality surrounding them. You'll get, instead of the best outcome and analysis, you'll get this other thing, which we don't want, which is that judges won't talk to each other, especially across sort of ideological lines. And we need the best minds that we can get on the court, and their best product, which comes from a deliberative process and arguing back and forth. And if they can't trust each other to keep their mouths shut about what happens in an argument, and I use the term in the sense of making legal arguments to one another about how a case should resolve, the court really cannot function. So I think that what we're likely to see, Mark, is some kind of more militaristic control over information with version numbers and retina scans and that sort of thing, with maybe not exactly that, but you get the idea. A lockdown of a further lockdown of who has access to this information. Not that it was a wide circle before, but I think it'll be even more controlled.
We're here talking liberty with Scott D. Cosenza on the legal fallout of the SCOTUS leak, the constitutionality of Roe v. Wade, and much more. After this short break, we'll be back with Scott to dig even deeper into the ruling, what it presages, and what the government's next steps might be in either retaliating against the decision or looking for a legal workaround. Stay tuned to find out more as we continue our Roe v. Wade special edition here on Liberty Nation Radio.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
Okay, so let's talk about the actual document itself. What do you make of it?
I thought it was a very well-written document, and it was a really good opinion. When I first read it, I was interested in whether I thought it was authentic or not. Now we know it is, of course, because of the court's announcement that it was. But when it first broke, it was like, geez, is this the real deal? And it had the I immediately thought that it had the look and the feel of a Supreme Court opinion and the look and the feel of an Alito opinion. I've been reading Supreme Court opinions carefully for too many years to mention, and it just jumped off the page that this seemed legit. So that was sort of the first thing that jumped off the page. And the second thing is that Alito did, I think, what he needed to do for an opinion of this scope with Roe v. Wade, which was knocking down the reasons why that was a good opinion. He really decimated it, I thought, from a legal perspective. Why it didn't deserve.
How so? Please give me a little breakdown on this.
Let's take the stare decisis issue first. And what he says is
just for us non-legal people, could you just give us a brief rundown?
Stare decisis stands for the principle that something that has been decided should be left alone, basically, because of the reliance interest that people place on it, and other reasons for the kind of smooth running of society, absent some compelling reason. And almost all the justices are asked about this when they're in the appointment hearings. And there's has been an effort by those who support abortion access to call it a super precedent and ask justices about that. And Justice Alito broke that down completely and discussed to give something the value of stare decisis and a super precedent, or really just precedent at all. We have to examine somewhat the basis for the holding in the first place. And that's what he did. And he discussed the fraud upon the court that was committed during Roe and the misunderstanding they had of the facts, namely that for the right to be couched in the due process clause of the 14th Amendment, which is what they did in Roe in large part. They said that in the 14th Amendment, there is a provision that people shall not be denied the due process of law. And the Supreme Court in 1973 interpreted that to include a zone of privacy and that abortion rights were located within that zone. All right. Now, what Alito says is that for that to be true, at the time of the passage of the 14th Amendment, any right that a person says would be included in that zone of privacy would have to be sort of deeply rooted within the American legal tradition, even if it was not articulated specifically. And, as somebody who's interested in gun rights, that sort of springs to mind, meaning even though
from the very start, the idea that a person should have the right to own a firearm was inherent in the founding of the country.
Right. Not just should, but did have. And whether or not they had the right that was specified in law, take the Second Amendment away from it, it was normal and regular that people had guns up until, from the founding of the country on through. But it wasn't the case for elective or surgical abortion for obvious reasons. And so I thought that was a powerful argument that he made, knocking down that reason for deference to Roe.
Now, this is what we'd call a bright line ruling, I guess, isn't it?
You know, Mark, there's something extraordinarily special for those of us, I think, who read these opinions for a great bright line rule. I love them. I hate the kind of nebulous, wishy-washy opinions where you get done with it and you think, okay, this is just like a lawyer's full employment act, because they're going to be fighting about it for a generation about what it means. I said that when the Heller case came out, for instance. It was so nebulous about where the line is. And to the direct answer to your question is yes, this is a bright line rule. There's no confusion or debate about what it means. It absolutely just sets Roe aside and says that's not good law, and now we're reverting to the states. And it says explicitly in the opinion in several places that this does not address issues of when life begins and when life does not begin, and what rights a life in gestation may have. Just about Roe.
So if this opinion as written now is the one that comes out, do opponents of the decision, do they have any recourse at all?
They could pass a constitutional amendment that enshrines the right to an abortion in our Constitution. That would be the most direct, response that would enshrine the right in the Constitution.
So if Joe Biden and his merry band of Democrats do decide to try and codify a right to an abortion in law, federal right, won't that again be challenged by the very same people who've been challenging Roe v. Wade for all these years?
I've seen these, sort of political statements by those Democrat politicians generally that talk about codifying Roe in the federal law. And I don't understand what they're talking about, Mark, because if Roe is not constitutional, which is what this opinion would say, I don't understand how that legislation helps anything. So yes, that it baffles me why that would be important.
Well, of course, adding 5 or 6 extra justices who do say it's constitutional would make all the difference in the world, Scott.
Well, that is a different kettle of fish altogether. And yes, it would.
Scott D. Cosenza, thank you ever so much for joining us.
Cheers, Mark. Thank you.
And that almost wraps it up for this week on Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. Before I give you my parting thoughts, I'd just like to give my thanks to today's guests, Leesa K. Donner, James Fite, and Scott D. Cosenza. And of course, my thanks to you always, the listeners out there, for taking your time to join us. Here are a few things to think about. When the ruling is finally released, assuming it's at least familiar to the draft leak, abortion in America will not end. Those that tell you it will are, at best, ignorant and at worst, lying to further their own political agenda. When Roe v. Wade is removed, states will revert to the laws they had on the books before the 1973 decision. In fact, the reality is that for most people, life will go on just the same as before, despite the doomsaying prophesized in the legacy media. In fact, in the 50 years since Roe was first passed, no Congress nor president has made a genuine effort to craft a law that codifies abortion into law. All attempts so far have been not able to gain enough bipartisan support, which reflects the feelings of actual Americans. It's a divisive issue that seems in many ways impossible to get a nationwide consensus on. And perhaps that alone is enough of a reason to pass the decision on to individual states. And finally, with this Supreme Court opinion, America isn't being flung back to the dark ages. Regardless of which side of the debate you fall on, what it does allow is states, and really the people in those states, to make a determination about what kind of laws they want, and even where they live. It's one of the most beautiful and special things about the United States that you can move freely state to state and still be an American. You can choose to live in a state that reflects your values, that upholds your beliefs, and you can take an important role in shaping those laws by using your right to vote. The court decision gives power and voice to the people. And that's something that should always be celebrated.